Hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here today and present some of our research where we ask the question, what kind of acculturation expectations does a minority group have towards majority group members? Just to give you a bit of a background, as you know, there is a growing body of research that shows that majority group members in many different types of countries adopt the culture of minority groups. However, what we know strikingly little about currently is how this acculturation is perceived by minority group members. What kind of expectations do they hold towards majority group members? This is indeed a blind spot in acculturation research that was recently observed. So as marked in green, you can see areas of acculturation research that are really well researched. On the right-hand side, you can see that the question of what kind of expectations majority group members hold towards the minority groups. That is obviously a topic that is well researched. There are hundreds of studies that have focused on this topic. We know even more about the left-hand side, namely how minority group members themselves acculturate. Hundreds of studies have been conducted on this topic. However, there are two issues we know surprisingly little about. First, we don't know very much about what kind of acculturation expectations majority group members have towards their own group, but maybe most critically, we don't really know what kind of acculturation expectations minority group members have towards the majority group. And now you can ask why this is important, and I will give you a few reasons. So first, the recognition that members of minority groups hold expectations towards members of majority groups, rather than only the opposite, acknowledges their role as equitable agents in the shaping of ethnically diverse societies. And secondly, their expectation is really critical for understanding when majority group members' acculturation constitutes genuine egalitarian change versus cultural appropriation. In a recent paper, we tried to create a theoretical framework to understand when cultural adoption can be regarded as cultural appropriation versus a genuine cultural change. This is a rather complex and multifaceted framework, but it really boils down to one factor, and that is whether the adoption of a culture is consented to by the group whose culture is adopted. So that is really the core criteria that determines whether the adoption of another culture constitutes cultural appropriation or genuine cultural change. So these theoretical notions really informed the objectives of the present study, where we had three main goals. The first goal was to determine what acculturation minority group members expect from the majority group. Secondly, we wanted to see whether their expectations differ from those that majority group members have towards minority group members. And third, we wanted to see whether threat perceptions underlie these expectations, both among minority group members and majority group members. So to test this, we conducted a study with 246 Muslim minority group members from the UK and 247 Christian white majority group members from the UK. On the right-hand side, for interested readers, you can see some of the demographics, but I just want to highlight their ethnic background. So the Christian majority group members were 200% whites, whereas the Muslim minority group was much more heterogeneous, with many people having an Asian background or, for instance, an Arab background. And we assessed 6 types of measures. First, we measured to what extent each group perceived the other group as a symbolic threat or as a realistic threat, with 2 different measures. Then we assessed each group's acculturation orientations. That means to what extent they were motivated to maintain their own culture and to what extent they were motivated to adopt the culture of other groups. And importantly, for minority group members, that would mean to what extent they were motivated to maintain their heritage culture and to adopt the dominant British culture, whereas for majority group members, it would mean to what extent they were motivated to maintain the British culture and to what extent they were motivated to adopt the culture of immigrants and minority group members. And then importantly, we also assessed to what extent they expected each of these orientations from the other group. That means that we asked minority group members to what extent they thought that majority group members should maintain their British mainstream culture, and to what extent they thought that these majority group members also should adopt the culture of minority group members and immigrants. For majority group members, we asked these expectations in a classical sense. That means we asked to what extent they thought that minority group members should maintain their heritage culture, and to what extent they thought that these individuals should adopt the mainstream British culture. So I will now walk you through some of the results, starting with comparison between both groups on our main measures. What you can see in these first graphs here is that generally Muslim minority group members perceived more threat than Christian majority group members. And this was especially marked for realistic threat perceptions as compared to symbolic threat perceptions. Next, in terms of their acculturation orientations, we did not find any significant differences for own culture maintenance, meaning that both Christian majority group members and Muslim minority group members scored a bit higher than the midpoint of the scale, meaning that they did, to some extent, value the maintenance of their own culture. When it comes to other culture adoption, we did find some difference. Specifically, Muslim minority group members adopted the culture of the other group, that means of the mainstream British society, to more of an extent than Christian majority group members adopted the culture of immigrants and minority group members. And finally, when we focus on the expectations, we see that in both instances, the expectations are higher among Christian majority group members than among Muslim minority group members, meaning that Christian majority group members both had a higher expectations that minorities adopt the British culture and the higher expectations that they maintain their heritage culture. However, what is very important to note here is, even though this expectation was lower among Muslim minority group members, it was remarkably normally distributed. So if you look at the graph for other culture adoption expectation, you can see that there was clearly not on average an objection towards majority group members adopting the culture of minority groups. Next, to kind of diagnose the possible motivations between these own orientation and expectation variables, we investigate their correlation between the threat measures. And in terms of the own orientation measures, we find that the degree of cultural maintenance preference, both among Christians and Muslims, is positively related to threat perceptions. So meaning that people who perceive higher degrees of threat, they also maintain their heritage culture to more of an extent. That is pretty consistent with previous research. But what about the relationships with the acculturation expectation variables? For Christians, the more these individuals perceived the other group as a symbolic or realistic threat, the more they expected from them to adopt the mainstream British culture, and the less they wanted them to maintain their heritage culture. So again, pretty consistent with previous research. However, strikingly, such a relationship was not observed among the Muslim minority group members. We did not find a significant association between threat perceptions and their expectations towards the majority group. In the next step, we conducted some cluster analysis to identify the different acculturation orientation clusters in both groups. On the left side, you see the Christian majority group. On the right side, you see the Muslim minority group. And generally speaking, you can see that we found the integrated, separated, and diffuse cluster in both groups. However, the integrated cluster was much larger among Muslim minority groups than among the Christian majority group. We then conducted some ANOVA analysis comparing the own culture maintenance expectation toward the our group and the other culture adoption expectation toward the our group between the different types of acculturation clusters in both groups. And I would try to walk you through these results because they're a bit complex and it takes some time to really understand them. So what you can see is that integrated individuals, both of Christian and the Muslim group, generally prefer that the respective outgroup should maintain their heritage culture. However, when it comes to other culture adoption expectation, we see that integrated majority group members indeed expect this adoption from the other group, whereas integrated Muslim minority group members didn't really care that much about whether the majority group would adopt the culture of minority group members or not. Next, in terms of separation, we find some interesting group differences, especially if we look on the right-hand side. What we see is that separated majority group members very strongly endorse that the respective other group, that is immigrants and minority group members, adopt the British mainstream culture. However, separated minority group members don't really show this preference. And finally, the diffuse clusters of interest. These are individuals who cannot be clearly identified into one of the classic acculturation strategies that are typically observed. And as you can see here, both Christian majority group members and Muslim minority group members who were diffuse, they did not see much importance in the other group adopting their respective other culture. However, when it comes to own culture maintenance expectation, you see that Christian majority group members who were diffuse, they still saw it as relatively valuable for the other group to maintain their culture, whereas Muslim minority group members did really not see this as much important neither. So to sum up the results, minority group members in our study showed higher other culture adoption than majority group members. At the same time, minority group members showed lower other culture adoption expectations than majority group members. And we also find that acculturation expectations seemed rooted in threat perceptions among majority group members, but not necessarily among minority group members. So that was quite a striking difference between both groups. And finally, we find that separated majority group members, that is people who themselves are separated, expected the most other culture adoption from the minority group. In comparison, integrated minority group members expected the most other culture adoption from the majority group. So again, two interesting differences. So the take-home message can be defined as the following. Minority group members seem to not uniformly object to majority group members adopting their culture, and that is pretty evident based on the normal distribution of this acculturation expectation. If they would object to it, generally it would be skewed, but it wasn't. We also find that threat does not seem to distinguish minority group members who object to from those who favor this adoption among majority group members. And tentatively, these insights could suggest that minority group members on average did not perceive majority group members' cultural adoption as culture appropriation. However, there are various limitations that we really need to consider in this interpretation. First, although we observed a normal distribution, this also means that some minority group participants scored on the lower end of the distribution, meaning that they disfavored the cultural adoption of majority group members. And it can really be that other factors than threat may explain their opposition. And I look very much forward to hear your thoughts in this regard. Next, it is important that our study really only indirectly addresses the question of cultural appropriation, because we did not directly ask people whether they consented with their culture being adopted. That is an obvious research question that future research should ask. I think that's a very, very important avenue for future research. And it is also important to note that context obviously matters. We only conducted the study in one country with two groups, and future research is needed to replicate our findings in other settings and also in different types of groups. It's very much possible that some groups may endorse majority group culture adoption more than others. This was everything that I had to present in this talk. I look forward to your questions and to a fruitful discussion. Thank you.